Hello and welcome again to Thursday Thoughts. Thank you so much for joining me as we discuss the life and the legacy of Daniel. If you will recall, last week we were toward the end of chapter 4 and we saw what horrible things had happened to Nebuchadnezzar because of his pride. In fact, we realized that after a full 7 years, when he finally realized that it was important to acknowledge the authority, the sovereignty of God, and he humbled himself, then God returned his mind to him, his officials to him, and his kingdom to him. And we see at the end of this chapter that he is extolling the God of Daniel. He is making sure that those in the kingdom know that they are to honor that God, because what had happened to him was totally unheard of, most definitely miraculous. And so his honor and majesty are restored, but along with it, a lesson that he learned the hard way, and that is that God resists the proud and he exalts the humble. Now, as we see this chapter end, and we see this lesson that he has learned, then we realize that he's honoring the God of heaven, the King of heaven. But again, I warn you that that does not mean that he is now totally in allegiance to God and refusing to worship any kind of idols, because that's just not true. He does, however, know that those who walk in pride are in trouble with God. Now, we need to set up, because we're at a transition phase. If you recall, if you've been with me for the entire study, that Nebuchadnezzar II, that's who this is, started his reign about the time Jerusalem was being raided, about 605 BC. And we fully believe that he reigned about 44 years, give or take. He died about 561 BC, and his reign was literally the heyday of Babylon. The Babylonian Empire was at its peak. Its splendor was at its highest level. Its control of the territories that it had conquered was absolute. However, once Nebuchadnezzar died, some things began to change, and the stability that the kingdom had known waned, most definitely. In fact, even though there was about a 22-year period where Babylonian continued to reign, it was a very unstable period. And at least 20 years of that time, Cyrus the Persian was already nipping at the heels of Babylon, and you began to see what was going to happen. It was inevitable. Now, when Nebuchadnezzar died, his son Amel-Marduk took the throne. Now, he was the first of several in quick succession. He was a son of Nebuchadnezzar. I might point out that Marduk was the dominant god of Babylon. So you're going to see, even though I'm not going into detail with these next few kings, the meanings of their names, almost all of them are tied directly to some idol. So this guy, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, reigned from about 562 to about 560 BC, not a stable time at all. And then he was replaced by Neriglissar, and he reigned from 560 to about 556 BC, and he was actually the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, married to Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. His son, Labashai-Marduk, took over reign from him, and he was the son of Neriglissar and the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And what you see during this time period is very short reigns, a lot of subterfuge, brother killing brother. If you're a history buff, you might be interested in looking some of that up. Obviously, the stability was gone. When he left the throne, it was because there was a coup and a power overturn, and Nabonidus took the throne, not at all hesitant to destroy a family member in that process. Now, Nabonidus was an interesting character. He reigned from 556 to 539 BC, but a good portion of that time he was away, and his co-regent, his son Belshazzar, who was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, actually reigned. Nabonidus was off building temples. From what we learn from history, his mother was a priestess in the temple of a pagan god, and he had very strong allegiance, and it wasn't the dominant god of Babylon, and it kind of netted him some criticism. Later on, we're going to realize that when Cyrus defeats Babylon, Nabonidus is going to be exiled to what we know as Iran today, and his son Belshazzar is going to die. And the turnover and the defeat of Babylon will at that point be complete. Now, with that background, as we begin chapter 5, the transition from Babylon, the head of gold, to Medo-Persia, the arms and chest of silver, is about to take place. It might help you to know that another 25 years has passed. Now, let me make sure that you followed me. We've talked about 10 years passing and 20 years passing and 25 years passing, so that it is clear that by this point in time, Daniel has been in Babylon 65 to 70 years. That makes him 80 to 85. When some people would be resting on their laurels and consider their life's work has been completed and is done. So that's what we find here as we begin. Now, this grandson of Nebuchadnezzar apparently is not as dependent on Daniel, would obviously know who he is, but Daniel is no longer enjoying that prestigious position that he once held at court. So as we begin chapter 5, that's the background that we need to know. The grandson of Nebuchadnezzar is on the throne, basically a co-regent with his father, Nabonidus. Nabonidus is gone much of the time, so this very impudent, this very arrogant and prideful playboy king is on the throne. We begin our reading chapter 5, verse 1, and I am reading today from the New King James Version. A couple of things are plain in this particular version in this chapter, so follow along with me. Verse 1. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked against each other. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father and the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers, inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting of dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. Several things for us now. Again, remember, Daniel is about 85-ish. Kings have come and gone. Power and authority has changed. But he continues to consistently serve God, to be the man of character and integrity that we have seen so far. You're going to see, beginning with this chapter, our only references to Nebuchadnezzar are in terms of his descendants. So Nebuchadnezzar's obviously dead. The story begins here with a huge banquet that is being given. The king, Belshazzar, by the way, it keeps calling Nebuchadnezzar his father, but the correct way to interpret that would be his ancestor, because he is definitely Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. So he's hosting this feast for about 1,000 high-ranking guests. Now, we're not shocked at that. We saw the very same thing at the beginning of the book of Esther. So obviously, he's entertaining important people in his kingdom, but I need to make you clearly see that we're going to see arrogance like we have not seen since Nebuchadnezzar dared to say, "Look what I've done." So this king has, I don't know, all these people gathered and clearly giving no thought to what's going on right outside the walls of his own city. Now, hear me. Babylon was amazing. There was a 30-foot moat surrounding the city. The walls were gigantic. You could chariot race on top of them. There were 100 watchtowers. They had a 20-year food supply stored up. They had plenty of water because the Euphrates River actually ran through the city. So basically, this drunken playboy king feels safe, as if he has no reason to fear the enemy that is literally outside the wall. He knows that Cyrus and the Medo-Persian troops are outside the walls of his city, and he gives no thought to that, and he's having a party. I hate to say it, but it reminds me sometimes of people not watching what's going on in our world and still just blowing off the idea that Jesus is going to return and that they need to be ready. So here this king gives no thought. He is just lethargic. He's passive. He's partying. And danger is right outside the door. Now, this 1,000 guests would not include the people who were serving, the people who were standing guard, wives or concubines, because women don't count, and anyone who was considered a lower level of person. Now, it's possible that the number in this banquet hall was 2 or 3 times the number that the Bible records. Just so you will get a feel for the truth and the accuracy of this description, archaeologists have actually uncovered a massive structure buried under rock and debris of time, and it measures 56 feet by 173 feet, and that would be about the size of the main portion of the White House. So to say he couldn't have had a room, he couldn't have had a party and a banquet that large is ludicrous, because obviously he could. Now, not only was this a huge banquet with an enormous number of guests, we have to understand that it was everything but a dignified dinner. It didn't look like a state dinner at the White House, because everything that was considered protocol for a king in that time frame was being violated. First of all, women were invited to the banquet. I need to remind you that when Xerxes demanded that Vashti come into his banquet, she refused because she was having a separate banquet for women. You'll recall that from Esther chapter 1. So the fact that women are mixed in here is completely unusual, not the norm, and would not have been considered proper protocol. Not only that, he is drinking heavily in front of his guests. You might recall the advice to King Lemuel in Proverbs 31 verses 4 and 5. It was considered wise practice for kings not to be drunken and to drink in front of guests, in front of people in their court, because the king was to present a dignified air. He was to have his thoughts collected, his mind clear. So again, we have this king, danger lurking. He's violating everything that wisdom would dictate, and he simply seems to give it no thought. So in this drunken state, completely in a foolish frame of mind, he calls for the vessels that Nebuchadnezzar stole from the temple of the Lord, vessels that had been collected and kept there, vessels that were holy. I remind you that holy means set apart for God's use, not to be profaned or violated with worldly use. Now, in this particular instance, he's basically flaunting Nebuchadnezzar's instructions that his kingdom honor the God of Daniel. He's basically flaunting any respect for a holy God that might exist anywhere. He's being audacious to the ultimate degree and sacrilegious beyond our comprehension. It's unfathomable what he was doing. He's actually toasting his own death and the downfall of Babylon without realizing what he's doing. Now, everything that happened that night was foolish and unnecessary, because prophetically, especially Jeremiah, had basically already listed everything that was going to happen to that kingdom on that particular night and how it was going to come about. Listen as there's a compiled list of these prophecies that might add emphasis to what I'm saying. So listen to what Jeremiah has already said. A northern nation would conquer the city in Jeremiah 50, verses 1 through 3 and verse 9. The nation would be associated with the Medes, Jeremiah 51, verses 11 and 28. Babylon was described as a greatly fortified city in Jeremiah 51, verse 53. It was explained that Babylon would be taken by a trick or by a snare in Jeremiah 50, 24. The city's demise would involve drying up water. Remember what I said about the Euphrates running through the city, and that's in Jeremiah 51, verse 36. This would all be accomplished while a great feast was in progress, Jeremiah 51, verse 39. And it would be accomplished while Nebuchadnezzar's grandson was in power, Jeremiah 27, verses 6 and 7. Now, all that's been prophesied. Cyrus is outside the walls with a great army. I mean, a huge army. If you're a history buff, read about the Medo-Persian army. And I need to emphasize, starting here, the Medes never were very much. Basically, Persia overran them. So if anything, the Medes are puppets, and Darius is going to be a puppet king. But that set aside, the enemy is at the gate, and he's having a drunken orgy. Now, the fortifications and the provisions inside this city are not going to be enough. Please hear me, sovereign God. It does not matter how big your army is. It does not matter what kind of store of weapons you got. When God says a nation is going down, it goes down. So the city had weaknesses. Whether this king acknowledged that, understood that, or even cared about that. Now, starting in verse 5, something supernatural happens, something scary. And this drunken king probably suddenly sobered up. It was of that magnitude. Notice the King James Version, as I was reading, said you could see the part of the hand that was writing. Some Bible scholars believe it was just fingers, some believe it was the hand itself. It doesn't matter. A large hand appears and begins to write in the plaster. I need to remind you that writing in plaster is no problem for our God. He's the one whose finger wrote in the tables of stone and gave the 10 Commandments to Moses. So there's no reason why this should surprise us at all. So here's the frightened king. He has knots in his stomach. And that phrase we use that talks about someone being so afraid that their knees knock together probably comes from this passage. This is one scared, wicked, arrogant king. In all likelihood, his mind is so fearful, he's on autopilot here, so he does what his ancestors have always done. He calls for the soothsayers and the astrologers and the Chaldeans because he's scared to death and he's confused. Now, let me make something else clear. The words written on that wall were not unknown to this king. They were Aramaic. He knew what the words were. He knew the literal meaning of the words. He just didn't know how all of that applied to him. And in his foolishness and in his fear, he's desperate to know. Because obviously, when a man's hand appears in such a position that the lampstand clearly shows what's happening, then we can understand why he was so frightened. Now, you're told here that the queen comes in. This would not be Belshazzar's wife. We already read earlier in this passage that concubines and the queen and women were there. In fact, from context and from original language suggestion, this was, as I said earlier, it was a drunken orgy. It was sexual. It was lots of alcohol. And they were, from all indications, literally drinking and toasting the gods with the temple vessels. So this woman who comes on the scene would be Nebuchadnezzar's wife. This would be the queen mother, still respected, the grandmother of Belshazzar. She knows exactly who Daniel is and what he could do. So what we're going to see is that she is going to recommend that this wicked king wise up and call the one who is able to interpret and clarify what's going on. And in exactly the same kind of language that Nebuchadnezzar used to describe and talk about Daniel. So that makes perfect sense. So go back with me now and let's begin our reading at verse 13 as we see this drama unfold before us. Excuse me. Verse 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought to Judah? I've heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of you that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing to the king, and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. Sovereignty of God, hear it. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. And whomever he wished, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. And you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways you have not glorified. Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, or Upharsin, there are a lot of different variations of that word. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, let's back up and make sure we don't miss any details here. Daniel was called into the banquet hall. Obviously, he's not the go-to guy for Belshazzar. He's not very far away either, though. When they call him, he shows up in the throne room or at the banquet hall. Now, Belshazzar says, are you that same guy? The one Nebuchadnezzar talked about? The one the Queen Mother's talking about? So surely he's heard the stories about Daniel. He's heard what happened to Nebuchadnezzar when he was arrogant and prideful and God debased him. Notice Daniel retells that story. I'll come back to that in a minute. So when Daniel walks into that banquet room and looks around and sees scattered before him the vessels that have been consecrated to a holy God, perhaps turned over, perhaps still halfway filled with wine, perhaps dropped onto the floor, it must have totally broken his heart, the same way it breaks God's heart when we profane what's holy and when we don't honor him. So Daniel quickly makes it clear. Belshazzar, look, you can keep your gifts. What would he want gifts from a king whose moments were numbered? Not days, not years, but moments. And not only that, why would he want the honor of a kingdom that honors God no more than these people were in the process of doing? So here's Daniel in his 80s, talking to this arrogant king without batting an eye, still giving honor to God, still making it clear that if you're arrogant and don't recognize your dependence on God, if you don't understand that God is sovereign and in control, then you're headed for a fall. We don't know if at this point Daniel has been focused on the writing on the wall, or if he's been focused solely on kind of getting this king straightened out with what his thoughts are. But at this point, clearly, he's recited what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He's basically set up this business of if you're arrogant, you're headed for a fall. And now he heads into the sins of Belshazzar and makes it clear that he's accusing the man of pride. He accuses him of lifting himself up against the Lord of heaven, for praising gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone. And notice what he said. They don't hear. They don't know. Instead of glorifying God. And did you know what he said? The God who has Belshazzar's breath in his hands. So finally, he moves his focus to the short message that's on the wall. Now, if you notice in Scripture, there are times when things are repeated. And when they're repeated, it's important because it's usually for emphasis. It's not redundancy and it's not an accident. It's on purpose. So he looks at the message, mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. It's just three Aramaic words. The first one is repeated for emphasis. And so he begins to explain. Now, I need you to understand, this message would have sounded like the shout of a merchant. Look, it's only a mina. It's just a shekel in two halves. It would have been almost like the chant of someone who was trying to sell a product, because every one of these terms is related to weighing or measuring products like you would do to sell them, to measure them out or to count them out so that a right amount could be traded for a certain amount of money. Now, the word tekel means weighed. It's clear. The word mene, it's like, here you go. It's been numbered. It's been counted. It's been measured. That's twice. And then tekel means weighed. And the last one means divided or halved. So you've been numbered. You've been weighed. You've way been found lacking or wanting. So now you're going to be halved. What's he saying? Your kingdom is wicked. You don't acknowledge God. You're arrogant. I have scrutinized this kingdom. I have scrutinized you, king. I have found you wanting, says God. And because of that, the kingdom is going to be stripped from you, divided between the Medes and the Persians. The transition is about to happen. Now, clearly, that guy's going to die this night. His father's going to live long enough to be exiled. But Belshazzar, in his arrogance, in his defiance of God, is finished. Cyrus is at the door. The raid happens while the banquet is still in progress, literally using what should have been the riverbed of the Euphrates to come under the walls and into the city by diverting the flow of the water. So what does that mean? Now, I notice also that Belshazzar promised Daniel that he'd be third in the kingdom, an honor Daniel doesn't consider an honor and doesn't want. Notice, if he's co-regent with his father, the highest position he could have offered Daniel would have been third. And none of it's going to matter, because that very night it was finished. Go back with me to the last two verses of that chapter. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. He was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So here you see, it's ominous, it's matter of fact, it's not debatable. Belshazzar lost his life that night in the middle of that drunken, sacrilegious, rebellious orgy. And there was a power shift, and that quickly. Even though it had been 20 years in the making, with the Medes and the Persians nipping at Babylon's heels, that very night it was a done deal. No matter how safe Babylon thought it was not safe when a sovereign God says, you're going to reap what you have sown. Now, down through history, mankind has learned the hard way that God is holy and he's omnipotent. And if he says it, it is going to happen. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. You've been checked out, and you just did not meet the criteria. Jack Hayford shared a kind of an analysis, a synopsis of that process that I'd like to share with you, and I quote him. God's response to Belshazzar's irreverent use of God's holy vessels is a warning that whatever God has sanctified is not to be profaned. According to 1 Samuel 24:10, the Lord's anointed were not to be touched. That is, human vessels who are set apart to him. Attributing the work of the Holy Spirit to the devil is considered blasphemy, because the Spirit's work is holy. Matthew 12:31-32. Therefore, regarding holy things as common is always dangerous. Those guilty will be weighed in the balances and found wanting. And I need to say it because it's still true. That's as true today as it was 500 years before Christ came. All right, now we've seen the transition. Babylon is gone. The Medes and the Persians are in control. Darius is basically a puppet, but now he's in charge. We've got Daniel in his mid-80s, a new kingdom in power. And I need to hear that the clarification for myself and for you, that you need to understand that it was incredibly amazing that Daniel rose to power in a foreign kingdom. It was beyond comprehension that Nebuchadnezzar could be acting like a lunatic for 7 years and hold on to his kingdom. But it is more incredible that you can have a second kingdom come into power and have the man Daniel become equally revered in that kingdom as he was in the Babylonian kingdom. Remember, he's a Jew. He doesn't exactly belong to either one of those kingdoms. So as we began chapter 6, clearly the amazing work of God through this man's life is not only not finished, it's about to step up a notch. Chapter 6, and let's look at the first 9 verses together. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. And over these, the 120, 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God." So these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, "King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, the counselors and advisors, have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter." Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. It seems that about 2 years have passed from the end of chapter 5 to the beginning of chapter 6. So, most definitely, Daniel could be as much as 87 by now. He's an older man. The organization of the new kingdom is most definitely in process. There are territories, different sections of this kingdom, and 120 satraps or leaders of a lower level of certain territories, kind of like our governors are under the president and the national leadership. So you see these men have been put into place to help to rule. And over this 120, we have 3 that are in this version called governors, and Daniel is one of those 3. But very quickly, it's important for us to note that Daniel in this 2 years has already distinguished himself to the point that Darius is considering elevating him above the other 2 governors and literally putting him over the entire realm. Now that's a big thing. So obviously his faith, his character, his dependability, his integrity, all of those things are clearly proven yet again. I need you to hear me. In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 14, twice, verses 14 and 20. Ezekiel, who's a contemporary of Daniel, Ezekiel was a prophet that was also hauled away to Babylon. and their lifespans overlapped some. And he lists Daniel as a very righteous man, and he does that in a very short list of righteous men. And those on that list are Noah, Daniel, and Job. That's a short list. So there's no doubt that because Daniel has risen to the top of the governing hierarchy under Darius, who, by the way, is clearly under Cyrus, we'll talk about that more later, there's no doubt that these other guys won't be jealous. Now, we've seen the role of pride in this book. We've also seen the role of jealousy and insecurity. So these men begin to scrutinize him. They begin to check him out. It's also important that you understand that when Babylon was gone and the Medes and the Persians took over, the absolute authority of the king changed. Do you remember whatever Nebuchadnezzar said was law? Did you hear Daniel say if he wanted to kill someone, he had them killed? If he wanted to spare someone, he had them spared. But now you have something called the law of the Medes and the Persians. And so there is more of an organized system of government and law. So if something is signed into law, the king cannot on a whim change his mind and revoke what has been written into law. So that's going to become a very important aspect of this particular governing body and also of its impact on Daniel. Now, because a lot of territory is controlled by the Medes and the Persians, and because these territories have to pay taxes, remember the stories about the tax collectors in the day of Jesus because they collected taxes for Rome. Just so taxes are collected for the Medo-Persian Empire. And so in order that the king not suffer loss, did you hear that language? In other words, so that people can't embezzle money or can't somehow plot against the king, excuse me, he's got this hierarchy of people in place who are accountable to him. And so that system sets up what we see developing because of the risk of so much dishonesty on a lower level of leadership and so much theft, so much embezzlement, so much illegal activity that could take place. So the three men who are over this 120 satraps have the responsibility to serve as checks and balances and accountability and check up on them to make sure that everything is right. Now, because an excellent spirit, we heard that reference, is in Daniel, because he is risen to the top yet again, because he is being honored, and we suspect these men knew that the king is partial to him, so they've decided to look for something they can use against him because he's a threat to them. His honesty and his integrity, the likelihood he's now going to be second under Darius, and because they're blatantly jealous and because they feel insecure, they've got to try to catch him doing something. Now, unfortunately for them, and commendably for Daniel, they literally scrutinize his life, his professional life, his private life, his work, his character, his work ethic, everything about him, to the degree that they give up finding something to use against him. I'm going to be honest with you. Should my life bear that kind of scrutiny, I'm sure someone could find something to use. But it is so commendable that this man lived at such a level of righteousness and rightness in his life that nothing could be found. That is an incredible compliment. They didn't mean it as that, but most definitely that's exactly what it is. So they come to this conclusion. Unless we can find something to use against him that relates to his utter devotion to his God, we will be hopeless to use anything against him. William Heslop said, "Never was a loftier tribute paid to mortal man than the enemies of Daniel paid to him that day. What a tremendous tribute to the trustworthiness of this public servant. The religion of Daniel operated with such power as to exclude everything in his conduct which might furnish a handle with which they might be accused and which he might be accused and justly hurt. Wow. So the scrutiny turns to, he is so devoted to his God, and he prays 3 times a day. Look at what he does. So they throng the king, fawning all over him, playing up to him, flattering him, lying to him, because they said, look, all of the rulers, all of the governors and satraps, all of your high-ranking people have gotten together and they've decided that we really need to pass this law because you, king, you're right up there with gods. Notice the flattery and the lie. Because one of the 3 top people under Darius in the kingdom is not included in this process. So the use of the word all is completely untrue. So what they're doing is basically proposing that Darius become like a god for about a month. And he is going to sign that into law. And let me remind you, once he does, it is not revocable. He can't do what Nebuchadnezzar could have done. Things have changed. Join me back again in Daniel 6 at verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. There it is. So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you sign, but makes his petition 3 times a day. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men approached the king and said to the king, now, know, O king, that it's the law of the Medes and Persians that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. So the king gave command, and they brought Daniel to cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. Whoa. Notice, when Daniel knew the law was signed, what does that mean? It means he's fully aware of the new law. He knows exactly what it demands. He knows that he's about to defy that law, but he changed nothing about what was already his routine. I need you to hear me. We've already seen that Daniel prays. He prayed before when he asked for the interpretation for the dream for Nebuchadnezzar. We're going to see throughout this book that he prays. His prayer life is already established. He doesn't decide to pray because things are getting tough. He continues what he has always done, and that habit that is already well established. So he goes to his house. He throws open the window toward Jerusalem. Now, that is not an accident. I need to remind you that when the temple was dedicated and Solomon prayed, and he said, God, when your people fail you, when they defy you and break your laws, and their enemies come in and haul them to faraway territories, but when they repent and when they turn and pray toward this city where you've established your name, forgive them and restore them. Daniel is doing exactly what he would have been taught as a child to do under the tutelage of his parents before he was ever hauled away to Babylon. He knows that praying toward Jerusalem is what he should do as he prays for his people to turn back to God, as he prays for his people to be delivered from the authority and control of foreign powers, as he gives thanks to God, as he shows gratitude despite what he, I suspect, knows is going to happen to him. Now, isn't it interesting? These guys know his habits so well. They know how often he prays, when he prays, where he prays. And so they show up at his house to cause him to be arrested and hauled before the king. They so are aware of his schedule, and he is so faithful, he is so predictable, that there's no guesswork here. There's nothing to try to figure out. He is doing what he has always done, praying as Solomon requested in 1 Kings chapter 8, and showing what a righteous man he is. So it's easy to catch him praying to his God. Now, here we know that they waste zero time hauling him before the king and telling the king what he's done. Did you notice that the king was displeased with himself? About this time, he is aggravated that he has allowed himself to be duped and fooled by flattery, by men who are not telling the truth, who are just playing up to him to get him to do what they want to do. So he's upset. He would like to protect Daniel. But guess what? He can't. The law has been signed. Now, let me make this clear. Not only is the law not reversible, the law of the Medes and Persians said that a penalty had to be carried out the day it was issued. So by sundown, Daniel has to go to the lion's den. So Darius waited to the very last possible moment before he said, okay, take him. No appeals were possible. No recourse was available. He had no choice. He was procrastinating, but there was nothing he could do. So they threw Daniel into the lion's den, rolled a stone in place, and there was a seal that could not be broken. It was a done deal. Now, I need you to hear me. God didn't keep Daniel from being thrown in the lion's den any more than he kept the Hebrew children from being thrown into the fiery furnace. We may not have seen an extra man in the lion's den, but God sent an angel, and it's basically the same thing. Listen to what I'm saying. And so here, again, God does not always keep us from the challenges, but oh, thank God, he never lets us face those challenges alone. Okay, verse 18, as I rush to try to finish this chapter. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him, and also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. Now the king was exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. And the king gave command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives, and the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Then Darius wrote, To all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, For he is the living God, and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions? So this Daniel, remember what Belshazzar said? Are you that Daniel? This Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now, here, the events of this night are pretty interesting because you see, Daniel sleeps like a lamb, not worried about being led to the slaughter, and he's literally watched over by lions. And Darius tosses and turns and can't sleep. The lions wanted to eat, but couldn't touch Daniel. The king could have had a banquet of food spread before him, but he couldn't eat. So things were turned upside down in Persia, in the Medo-Persian kingdom in that particular night. You know, you'll recall that Darius told Daniel, look, your God will protect you. The one you serve continually, he'll take care of you. But it would seem that Darius didn't have as much faith in Daniel's God as he claimed that Daniel had. That would be clear. Now, it's interesting when we hear this description of Daniel being thrown into the lion's den. Remember what we described about the fiery furnace? There actually has been an underground cavern-like structure found in Morocco by archaeologists that is probably very similar to what Daniel was thrown into. There would have been an opening at the top, large opening. Apparently, it would be possible to slide a stone across it because the cavern beneath was divided in half with a stone wall and a door in that wall. And what would happen is they would throw food down to the lions on one side, open that door from above, like pull it up, so that the lions could go to the side where the food was, drop that door, which would have been a stone, back into place, and then clean out the other side and then reverse the process. So here, Daniel would have been thrown into the side where the lions were, separate from any food that would have been available on the other side. He would have been set up to be dinner. And the process of doing that, we get a feel for that when it's clear later when Daniel's enemies are thrown in that they're devoured before their bones ever hit bottom, that they're being thrown in from the top of some sort of structure there. So this holding pen is where Daniel finds himself. Now, martyrs down through history have given their life. I don't know why God spared Daniel and didn't spare others whose lives have been taken. I'm not God and I'm not sovereign, but I know God has a plan. And his plan for this faithful man of God was not finished. In fact, when we go into the next chapter, we're going to see to what degree that is totally true. Now, the king is miserable all night. He goes running to that den for the lions when morning comes. He's like, Daniel, did your God save you, protect you? Are you okay? And Daniel's like, I'm fine. My God sent an angel to close the mouths of those lions. And God, he did that. God vindicated me because I had done nothing wrong. Nothing against him, and king, nothing against you. So the king is thrilled. He didn't want to throw Daniel in to begin with. But equally as happy as he is that Daniel is fine, he is very unhappy because the enemies of Daniel set a trap for him. And so he sends the decree that all of those men who plotted against Daniel would be killed. But not just the men, their families, their wives, their children. Some people think that that's horrible and brutal and shouldn't even be included in Scripture because it's so terrible. Understand that this kind of practice would have been common in this day. Understand the logic is that parents teach their children what to believe, and that things are passed on and that they'd just nip it in the bud by wiping out the family. Whatever you believe about that, it becomes very clear. In his past, Daniel was the source of the wise men being saved. He was the source of bringing good. But now evil has been brought on these men, including the satraps and governors, people that were in positions, whomever was involved. And now God's wrath is just simply being poured out. Darius is the tool, but anyway, there you go. God is God. His kingdom will not be destroyed. These other kingdoms and wicked men who take part of them don't realize that they are still under the dominion of a sovereign God, the one who delivers and rescues as he chooses. Now, just the same way that God protected and preserved Daniel, he'll protect us, because we have an enemy who walks about as a roaring lion. But we do not have to be afraid. God's power is not diminished just because there are problems in our world, and we can put our faith and trust in him just as much today as we ever had. As we move next week into the next chapter, we're going to see that this man who has proven faithful over and over again, who's interpreted the dreams of others, who stood true to his God, is now going to be used on a level in a prophetic realm above and beyond what he probably ever imagined. Not only that, but multiple times God is going to verbally put his stamp of approval on this man's life. I hope you will be right here with me next time as we go into Daniel chapter 7. Be blessed and keep your faith in the God who's able.